is a Toronto-based intersectional feminist activist, educator, and writer who works with Maggie's, Toronto Sex Workers Action Project. Chanelle has worked with sex workers in Australia, the US, and Thailand, and has been published in The Revolution Starts at Home, Dear Sister Letters from Survivors of Sexual Assault, The Walrus, and Spread Magazine, among others. Inspired by prison abolitionists, she co-founded the blog Everyday Abolition, which collects stories about how people resist prisons and policing in their everyday lives. Please welcome Chanelle.
Hey everyone. Podiums are so weird. Okay, can everyone hear me okay? Well, I'm loud, I don't really need a mic, but I know it's for the cart person. Okay, so I want to start by thanking everyone for having me here today and acknowledging the territories that we're standing on. And I'm going to offer gratitude and respect to the Indigenous people of this land. And also, I'm grateful for the powerful opening we had and for the opportunity to bring the elders into the room, so thank you for that. I'm also so delighted to be sharing this panel with Karin and Terri-Jean and Audrey. One of the reasons I love doing this work is because I get to hang out with really badass women. We're talking about what's next after the Supreme Court. And as Karin mentioned, it's very likely that the Conservatives are going to introduce a model that is called the Swedish model or the Nordic model. And so a lot of us don't really know much about this model. I had to get educated on it really quickly over the last couple of years too, when it looked like this was something that we might be living with. And if the question is, what does the Swedish model look like in real life? And I'm going to talk about that. The answer briefly is pretty much like Canada. It's not that much different than the systems that we had before the Bedford decision. And I'm going to explain that and break it down for you. So the Swedish model punishes clients. One of the main problems in doing that is that it works. It reduces the number of clients. But the state doesn't step in to actually replace any of the lost income for those sex workers. And so there's the same number of sex workers because they still need jobs, but there's fewer clients. And so the privileged people who created this garbage law, the Swedish model, don't seem to actually understand things like jobs and that people need them, no matter how much you might hate their job. So conservatives, fundamentalists, and prohibitionist feminists are all like, let's get rid of the evil of exploitation against women. Again, as Karin mentioned, not recognizing at all the diversity of genders actually in the sex trade. And sex workers of all genders are like, well, hi, but you're not paying my rent, and so I still need a job. So when the Conservatives introduce the Swedish model, like as they likely will this year, it's not going to come with plans for affordable housing, or daycare, or increases in welfare or disability rates, is it? I haven't heard that. So of course people are going to stay in their jobs, only now their jobs are going to be harder and more dangerous. In fact, their whole lives are going to be more dangerous. So it strikes me as incredibly disrespectful of working people to steal their jobs instead of supporting them in improving their workplaces. Every worker deserves rights, respect, and self-determination, especially those who might be facing exploitation and violence in sex work or any work. Workers who are undocumented, youth in the sex industry, all of us. I don't believe in leaving anyone behind. So I'm going to talk about how the Swedish model reshapes the working lives of sex workers and how it also impacts their intimate lives. So Swedish researchers themselves, the National Police Board and the National Council on Crime Prevention, found that after the law was introduced, there was no reduction in prostitution since the ban on purchasing sex. What has happened is that it has become more hidden. That's how they described it. So how is it being hidden? Who's being hidden? What happens to people who are hidden? Well, how it works is similar to Canada. Areas where sex work is happening on the street are subjected to police surveillance and harassment, and this scares away clients. Like I said, people need their jobs, so sex workers just have to move to more and more isolated, dangerous areas to find those clients. Being pushed into more isolated areas means they're pushed out of neighborhoods they're familiar with. They're no longer able to work with the people they're used to working with who might warn them about aggressors posing as clients in the area. Workers make less money, and so they have to stand longer on the street, hustling harder for fewer clients, taking clients they might have turned down before. Katrina Pacey of Pivot once said to me, if people don't like street work, they sure aren't going to like the Swedish model, because the Swedish model actually increases the amount of time someone needs to spend on the street. Clients are scared of law enforcement and are in a rush, and so workers have to make those snap decisions about whether to go with them, preventing them from taking the basic safety precautions, like checking to see if his appearance matches someone described on the bad date list, detecting whether he's under the influence of alcohol or drugs, very importantly, assessing if there was anyone else in the vehicle with him, and checking in with the worker's own intuition about the client. Instead, what it looks like is jumping into a car quickly in a poorly lit, isolated area without other sex workers around, going with clients they might have turned down in the past, offering services they might not have offered in the past, but now they need to because money is so much tighter because there's fewer clients. This all adds up to an increased vulnerability to violence on the job. And this should sound familiar because this is similar to what we have had here. And police have used this style of enforcement here in Canada. In 2001, Montreal police used this method to undertake raids on clients. The Montreal sex workers organization Stella tracks incidents of violence against sex workers, and they saw that in the months following those raids, the violence against street-based workers skyrocketed. There was a 300% increase in assault and a 500% increase in assault with a deadly weapon. So when I asked them why this happened, they reported the same reasons that I outlined above. Snap decisions. It was overwhelmingly against street-based workers who were made vulnerable for all those reasons I just outlined. And this research repeats itself and repeats itself everywhere in the world. It's not rocket surgery. It's very well established. So who is this impacting? Well, any change isn't going to impact sex workers equally. We don't live in an equal world, and the laws don't impact people equally, and you all know that if you're here. So far and away, the majority of the violence is directed at sex workers who are street-based, even though the majority of sex work is indoors. In Sweden, they did see a 50% drop in street work, which they claimed as a victory. But this happened at the same time everywhere in the world because of the introduction of cell phones and the internet, and a large bulk of sex work moved indoors. And people are still on the street in Sweden because in order to be an indoor worker, you need to have an indoor. You need to have a home, right? And not everyone has that. So while street work has dropped, the number of migrants in street work grew until they're now 50% of street workers. So again, we see this familiar pattern where racialized and migrant people are being over-policed and pushed into the least protected parts of work where they have the least supports. For indoor workers, it's also a problem. Clients want to be more hidden, right? They're trying to avoid law enforcement, they're subjected to surveillance and stings, and so what they do is they increasingly refuse to give screening information like phone numbers and emails to sex workers who are trying to screen bad dates out. They start to prefer what are called out-calls instead of in-calls, where the sex worker goes to their location instead of staying in their own. And for those of you who don't know, that is more dangerous for the sex worker because someone else's location is not under your control. Regarding public health, if you can believe this, in Sweden, HIV prevention with clients was completely halted because that was seen as supporting prostitution. Possibly one of the dumbest public health moves I can imagine, but this is what happens when you put moralism about sex work above the actual needs of sex workers. So it is still illegal under the Swedish model to hire anyone as support, security, reception, a driver. It remains illegal to work collectively with other sex workers, like in Grandma's house. And for those of you who don't know, Grandma's house was the home of an Indigenous trans sex worker named Jamie Hamilton, who opened up her home for other street-based workers in the downtown east side, in the midst of the Picton slaughter. She was shut down by the police. Grandma's house is still illegal in Sweden. So if you think that the Swedish model decriminalizes the sex worker while just punishing the buyers, think again. The legal models of Sweden and Canada aren't that different, and that's exactly why the Conservatives like it, because it's business as usual and the sex workers pay the price. I once heard Terri-Jean refer to the Canadian laws about sex work as the Picton model, a very grim description of what we have, the perfect storm that allowed predators to prey on sex workers for decades and get away with it. The Swedish model is the Picton model by another name. So I've shared the bad news about how the Swedish model damages sex workers' safety and freedom at work, but it also has a larger impact on the private life of a sex worker, and it leads to increases in partner violence. In July of last year, a woman named Petite Jasmine, a sex worker from Sweden, was murdered by her ex-husband. He had been abusive, he'd stalked and threatened her, but despite this, he had been given custody of their children because Jasmine was a sex worker. He'd called her in about it, and he'd reported her, and she was deemed unfit as a result. The courts told her she did not understand that she was self-harming by being a sex worker, and that she lacked insight and was romanticizing sex work, so they took her children away. They did not offer any protection from her abusive ex. How did the Swedish sex work laws contribute to Jasmine's death? 1. This model still makes it illegal to house a sex worker, just like in the Picton model. So that means sex workers in abusive situations are more likely to be stuck and unable to get new housing if they want to leave their partner. And people in the anti-VAW sector acknowledge that access to housing is key for stopping domestic violence, especially for mothers. 2, because sex work is defined from the start as violence against women, social service agencies will remove sex workers' kids, as they did with Jasmine, if they find out. The abusive partner knows this and threatens to reveal it to social service agencies if she tries to leave. This is what happened to Jasmine. Her kids were removed within hours of her ex reporting her. 3, sex workers have an antagonistic relationship to the police, so they can't call for help when their partner is abusing them. Again, many people can never call the police for help because of the systemic oppressiveness of police. But for those who would even consider it, they have to consider, what if my partner discloses my sex working status? 4, sex workers are actually refused domestic violence supports on condition that they leave sex work. So they can't even access supports they need to get out of an abusive relationship and stay alive. And this can have fatal impacts. 5, remember the problem of the fewer clients that I mentioned, and how people actually just keep working because they need to. Well, drug using and homeless sex workers have reported that how this impacts them is then they become more dependent on individual clients, who are sometimes drug dealers, sometimes sugar daddies, and therefore more vulnerable to exploitation in those relationships with them, which are sometimes romantic relationships. And that is Swedish feminism, also known as the white savior industrial complex. Thankfully, though, we can do much better than this. In 2003, sex workers themselves, and not some saviors, developed a New Zealand model of decriminalization that explicitly included labor protections for sex workers. The New Zealand model prioritizes human rights and health and safety. It's supported by sex worker groups, women's groups, YMCAs, and Indigenous groups in New Zealand. Workers there report feeling safer and being able to exercise more control over their work, including street work. And that has meant that in 10 years following the introduction of the law, there was not one reported case of trafficking. This approach actually works. Of course, nothing is perfect, and there are problems with this approach as well. But it works so well that earlier this year, a sex worker was actually granted $25,000 in a human rights case that she put forward against her boss. She had a sleazy, sexually harassing boss at a brothel, and she won $25 grand from the Human Rights Board in her complaint against him. Yeah. I also just want to mention that the MP who proposed this law was a Maori woman and former sex worker, Georgina Bayo. And I say that because I want to lift up how much of this work is being done by Indigenous women. So I want to talk now about moving beyond legal reform toward a broader vision of collective liberation. So we have the solutions. We know what works. We have the research on it. Why isn't this model being introduced? We know that it makes workers safer, it's better for public health, it's better for HIV prevention, it reduces trafficking. Why would everybody be jumping on this? Well, it was in the work of Anishinaabe scholar Naomi Sayers that I learned that the first anti-sex work laws in Canada were in the Indian Act. Her research points out how sex work laws were introduced in Canada as a way of controlling Indigenous people, women in particular, and was part of attempts by European settlers to destroy women's autonomy over their bodies and get access to land and resources. European settler colonialism and patriarchy are at the root of the problem of the oppression of sex workers. It's for this reason that, I want to get this pronunciation right, hold on, Wak writer and activist Sarah Hunt writes, I'm going to quote her, "Canadian law is violent. As Indigenous people, we know this more clearly than anyone. Police, social workers, and other state officials have used the law to remove us from our lands, remove our children from our homes, lock up our loved ones in schools, jails, and hospitals. At the same time, laws against murder, abduction, sexual abuse, and other forms of interpersonal violence have failed to stop these crimes from being committed against us at overwhelming rates. Why do we continue to seek answers to violence within a violent system? I fail to see how laws prohibiting various elements of sex work do anything but strengthen the hold this violent system has in our lives." End quote. Introducing more policing and enforcement is not neutral. Most sex worker strolls are pushed into low-income or working-class communities of color already facing daily harassment and violence by police. Adding more police enforcement would increase racial profiling of suspected clients, increase numbers of Indigenous men and men of color in prison, and heighten the climate of fear in the communities where police already operate. And, just a moment for what this means for trans women of color who are profiled on the daily as sex workers, whether they are or not. We can expect any new laws or any increase in enforcement will reproduce these biases, and we don't need to leave people behind like this. We can do so much better. I'm going to show you the cover image for a report that was developed by Conservative MP Joy Smith to promote the Swedish model. This is the image, for those of you who can't see it. I couldn't get it up on here. But what the image is of a young white woman. She's maybe 12, with the hand of an adult black male over her mouth. Yeah, do you notice anything about this? Like maybe it's disgusting racism? Maybe the complete manipulation of information about who's in sex work? I think that this image, which was ripped down, basically was released and then they realized what they had done and it was immediately removed. But the racism of this image speaks volumes to the underlying fears and stereotypes fueling the conservative agenda regarding sex work. This is the fear of the black pimp. Let's be real about that. They're never going to say that, but that's what the Swedish model is about. It is racism. And what I'm saying is let's put the power into the hands of oppressed communities, not more money and not more power into the police. How can we do this? I'm going to quote Sarah Hunt again. She says, quote, "The violence that Indigenous sex workers face while working cannot be isolated from all the other forms of violence they might experience as Indigenous people. Challenging the normalization of violence against Indigenous people, especially Two-Spirits, girls and women, means addressing our humanity. This requires broad social change, education, listening to each other, and creating reciprocal relationships of responsibility. The law cannot do this for us," end quote. And while she's talking about Indigenous women, I read that and I thought that speaks to every sex worker that I know. I mean, that speaks to every marginalized community that I know and our relationship to the criminal legal system. Any legal reform, I want to follow up with another little comment she made, which is that rather than advocating for more legal intervention into Indigenous people's lives and homes, diverse, community-specific solutions are needed to increase choices for sex workers. So any legal reform that involves an increase in the scope of the law, the powers of the police, or the control of the prison system over people's lives leads to an increase in exploitation, because this is actually in the DNA of the settler criminal legal system. I don't think you can improve it. This is what it's designed to do. We need solutions that reduce, not attempt to improve on, state power, and non-state-based solutions led by those most directly impacted. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how this is actually happening, what this looks like. All right, so legal professionals can and are doing some really amazing things. One big win, I don't know if it was last year or the year before, was with Women with a Vision in New Orleans. And that's an organization that works with primarily low-income, street-based sex workers, majority of whom are Black and POC. And they have a situation in Louisiana where there are two sets of laws against sex work. One of the laws, crimes against nature, was used almost exclusively against street-based Black and often trans sex workers. And what happened was that anyone convicted of this crime was then placed on a sex offender registry. This had horrible implications on people's lives. It was in capital letters on their driver's license. They had to notify people when they moved into a new neighborhood that a sex offender was moving to the neighborhood. It caused extreme problems, right? You're never going to get a job again. You're trying to actually, abolish sex work, and yet you've made it impossible for anyone with a conviction to do any other kind of work. And so Women with a Vision New Orleans, supported by legal professionals, actually was able to get that law struck down and to get those sex workers who had been convicted under that law taken off sex offender registries. So that was a really big legal win. That has a direct impact on people's lives. And the Supreme Court of Canada win that happened here last year is similar to that. It's about pulling the law off people's lives, not improving them. But I also want to remember that as the law itself is violent, we have to take an approach that rejects the law as a source of healing or remedy and focus on reducing the harms of the law, minimizing its role in people's lives while working toward the full abolition of the criminal legal system. I don't know if that's bad news for y'all, but that's what I believe in. And that's why Audrey invited here to talk to you, someone who does not believe in the criminal legal system at all. Okay, how to do this work. So I wanted to say a few words about allyship between non-sex workers and sex workers, specifically legal professionals. First of all, allyship to me, the word doesn't mean anything, but the word that does mean something to me is friendship. Are you friends, personal friends with any sex workers? If you don't have any current relationships with sex workers, are there ways you can offer them direct support? I'm talking about real life, personal relationships with sex workers where you're mutually invested in each other's happiness and well-being. And I see vulnerability as key to real relationships here, and especially important in friendships across difference. So this is my hard-nosed political advice. Go make friends, develop those friendships into relationships of real trust, and then work together in mutual struggle. Another is to find out why this issue, what this issue means to you and why you care. Why are you personally invested in the liberation of sex workers? And I really appreciated hearing some of that from Karin. Thirdly, be prepared to invest in it for the long haul. As Terri-Jean was talking about, this is not the kind of thing that you don't get snap wins. You could be working on something that takes years. And sometimes changes can come really suddenly and snowball, but sometimes if you really want to see real change, you might need to be in it for the long haul. Another is to support all sex workers equally, regardless of whether they are in sex work through choice, coercion, and circumstance. And by this I mean, don't cherry pick which sex workers you like and don't like. Always prioritize. The most important relationships are between sex workers with each other across difference. So more important than the relationship between a sex worker and an ally is between a trans and a cisgender sex worker, or between a street-based and an indoor sex worker. We need those relationships for our communities to be strong, and to remember that your job is to support all sex workers, no matter how they came to become sex workers, and to not play sex workers against each other as the good or bad ones. A little bit about taking on precedent-setting cases. Obviously, it's really, something really practical that legal professionals can offer is pro bono work. And sometimes pro bono work on important, transformative, precedent-setting cases, like with the Bedford decision. These are really important, and they're not everything. Because in the meantime, people are also dying, and you have certain privileges that can help. So in addition to that, as legal professionals, you can also offer, it's so powerful what your privilege can do. You can offer holistic services that help people with what they need in the moment, by letting them define what success means. And I'll just be real about that. What that means is, do they need help with their documentation? Are they undocumented people? Do they need help with name changes? They're trans folks and need help with that. Are they facing legal barriers to housing? Do they need help navigating the complexities of the legal system? People are targeted for being targeted for an act of survival, sex workers. And you can really do such powerful work humanizing them. It can be so powerful for a lawyer with all this privilege to affirm and say, yeah, your work is real work. I mean, it's amazing. You know, you will work with sex workers who, though they've been doing it for decades, will be like, yeah, I guess that is kind of work. Even though they, you know, because they're doing the work, but don't necessarily see it that way. Or affirming for them, you know, what happened to you was wrong. It's not okay. It's not okay for the judges and everyone else in this room to keep calling you by the wrong pronoun if you're working with trans clients. You can politicize your clients about the criminal legal system. And I think of this as Allyship 201, where you get other folks to see some of the links between their own experiences, even though you don't necessarily share them. If you're a teaching lawyer, how can you ensure that everyone under you also respects clients and model that? It's so powerful. The Supreme Court victory I think the victory may not end up being legal, because if we get the Swedish model like I've outlined, I don't think it may not substantially change things. We had the example here in Montreal where it might actually increase violence against street-based workers. What it is, though, is a psychological and spiritual win. Things might get worse for sex workers as the industry deals with new legislation, and people will keep working through that. But what has changed is that sex workers now feel this buoyant sense of possibility, like never before. So many workers are speaking up where they can now about their experiences. And sex workers and our allies are on the right side of history, and no matter what happens, there is no going back. People feel a sense of pride, they feel a sense of possibility now because of this decision. Sex workers around the world are creative, smart, funny, loving, strong, and highly capable. We are organizing everywhere in the world, and every day we take care of our communities to reduce HIV and violence. There's nothing intrinsically violent about sex work, but what our society has made so. Sometimes we forget this, but the reality is we do actually have all the tools we need to solve our problems. I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to me and to offer respect to my sex working ancestors who fought so hard and so long so that I could stand before you here today. It's on their shoulders that I stand, and I hope that I've been of service. I see my work as accountable to sex workers, and your feedback is warmly welcomed.